Quiet Strength, Chapter 2. Growing up in Jackson, to my way of thinking, was the way growing up was meant to be. Jackson is a small town in Michigan, about an hour from Detroit and 25 minutes from East Lansing. In addition to being my birthplace, it lay claim to being the site of the first official meeting of the Republican Party, brought together by the group's common opposition to slavery, and for years it housed the largest walled prison in the world. If those three things are linked, I haven't yet figured out how. So here in Chapter 2, he's kind of going back to his childhood and letting us know how he was raised. And we find out that he is from a place called Jackson, Michigan. Most of the jobs in Jackson revolved around the auto industry. Guys played high school sports, got out of school, and went to work at one of the big factories. They'd buy a car and get married. That's the way most of the guys I knew approached life. But because of our parents, we Dungy kids never thought that way. Both my parents were college graduates, and it was always assumed that my siblings and I would go to college. Our parents talked regularly about what we wanted to do and their visions of what we could do. Early on, I thought everyone's parents were like that. But later I learned that I was unusually blessed to have this sort of background. Growing up with educators gave me a different slant on things. More than anything, my mom and dad focused on exercising our brains, building both knowledge and character. My mom and dad wouldn't tell us, here are the steps, A, B, C, and D. Instead, they allowed us to figure things out for ourselves and to explore and grow. Who I am today and the way I think were shaped by that time with my parents. This is true of all the Dungy children. Our parents encouraged us to follow our dreams and told us that if we wanted to do something, we could do it. And they said if we did it the Lord's way, for the right reasons, we would be successful. Not that we would win every game or be wealthy, but that we would be successful in God's eyes if we did the things that glorify Him. I like that clarification there because I think a lot of times people are like, oh, if I do it the Lord's way, that means I'm going to be successful, right? I'm going to be wealthy, I'm going to have all of these things. But that's not necessarily what that means, right? You're not always going to end up a millionaire. Tony Dungy there says, right, not that we would win every game or be wealthy, but that we would be successful in God's eyes if we did the things that glorify Him. So I like that explanation on his part. Herm Edwards, a longtime friend and now head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, is always quick to remind me that, of all the Dungy children, I'm the one who is a football coach. I'm pretty sure he means that in a bad way. All three of my siblings are in professions dedicated to serving others. Sherry is a nurse at the Southern Michigan Correctional Facility near Jackson, devoting her life to inmate care. Lyndon is a dentist and recently opened his own dental practice. His dream has always been to give care to people who otherwise might not be able to afford it. Lauren, Lyndon's twin, is a perinatologist. She deals with high-risk pregnancies in Indianapolis and throughout Indiana. All three are exceptional at what they do. My line of work gives me more notoriety in some circles, but they're all doing things that are much more important in the long run. The three of them are definitely a living tribute to our parents and their values. I can still see my mother sitting quietly, intently reading every word, looking for more from the students she believed had been entrusted to her care and nurturing. Many times I was more than just an observer of this scene, as my mom enlisted me to grade papers for her students at Jackson High, where she taught English and public speaking. While I pored over the multiple choice questions that could easily be graded by an elementary school child, she marked up the essays. Once she had given a grade to each test, she let me record the grades in her book. Although I don't remember the exact names, here's how it went. John Smith, A. Steve Jones, B. Steve can do better than this. How am I going to get Steve to earn an A? He's not working to his potential. While my mom wanted to make sure she provided enough instruction for the voracious learners, she was more concerned with the students who didn't earn A's. She never really commented on the ones who got the highest grades. She was more worried about the one getting a B who should have been getting an A. She always had an eye towards her students' God-given potential. In my mom's mind, the burden was hers. How can I make the subject more interesting and keep their attention? My mom wasn't afraid to go against the grain of how things were usually taught if she could come up with a better way to reach and motivate her students. And when she did go against the grain, she always practiced it on us Dungy kids the night before. In football terms, we were her scout team. My mom ultimately did find a way to reach many of her students. I have received countless cards, letters, and calls from an entire generation who took classes from Mrs. Dungy during her 20 years of teaching, starting in 1966. I received a letter one day from a man in Detroit. I took public speaking from your mother at Jackson High in 1979. I've gone on to a career in business, and my ability to get up in front of groups can be traced back to that 10th grade class. I think the only downside my mom found to teaching at Jackson High and it was my fault, I guess, is that when I played football and basketball at rival Parkside High, she had to listen to her students talk about how they were going to shut her son down during any given game. My mom always insisted on teaching at least one elective English or public speaking class. She believed that many of the kids in Jackson decided far too early in life to finish high school and then immediately get a job at the glassworks, the metal shop, or the prison. My mom was concerned, almost fanatical, about making sure her students saw the many different opportunities the world held before deciding to end their education. She used Shakespeare and anything else at her disposal to do it. One student who took an elective from my mom has called me many times through the years. He had spent his entire childhood in the special education track of the Jackson schools. Although in special ed, he was able to take public speaking as an elective. Somehow, early in the semester, my mom realized that this student had been mislabeled a special ed kid. My mom did not rest until she got his counselor to place him in regular classes. Once he was reassigned, the student began to blossom, and eventually he went on to attend and graduate from Western Michigan University. He gives my mom complete credit for the career he has today. A life changed. So we can see this theme in the Dungy family of wanting to do something that matters, of choosing a career that will impact people and possibly even change people's lives. Right? His mom was a teacher who was deeply concerned about her students and wanting to make an impact on them and wanting them to reach their full potential. He's a couple of siblings that became doctors, and so on and so forth. And so we see that this family was very, they wanted to give back, right? And they wanted to make a difference somehow in others' lives. Even Tony, as a coach, obviously is making a difference in his players' lives. Our home was a small, green, 2-story house with wood siding and a dirt backyard. Any grass bold enough to try to come up would be instantly trampled by all the neighborhood kids, and my mom, playing whatever game was in season. I was in 7th grade before I beat my mom in a foot race. She and I often raced the 60 or 70 yards around the house. But until that memorable day in junior high, I had never once beaten her. Cleo May Dungy was a tall, athletic, energetic, and quick to laugh. But even as I remember that, my mind also sees her late in life, shrunken and withered, in a wheelchair from the years of battling the diabetes that ultimately took her life in 2002. My mom was born in Amherstburg, Ontario, and she played on Canadian junior basketball teams as a young girl. She carried the title of Most Athletic Dungy throughout her life. Between her love of basketball and serving as advisor to the cheerleading squad at Jackson High, she made sure we Dungy kids were exposed to all kinds of sports. All 4 of us, Sherry the oldest, the younger twins, Lyndon and Lauren, and I, always looked forward to Tuesdays and Fridays. On those afternoons, we rode on the activity bus to wherever Jackson High was playing, provided we'd been good that week and had completed our schoolwork. In contrast, my father was more interested in individual sports. I think he was motivated by the desire to continually measure his progress, and by the idea that he could improve by an act of will. As a boy, my dad participated in boxing and track and field. Throughout his adulthood, he still followed both regularly. Team sports, from his perspective, existed primarily for the life lessons they could teach his children. My dad was usually a quiet, thoughtful man, a scientist at heart and by training. Wilbur Dungy loved to be outside, enjoying the scenery. Fishing allowed him time to contemplate, to listen, and to marvel at God's creation. My dad used fishing to teach his children to appreciate the everyday wonders of the natural world God created: the sandy shoreline, the dark pine forests, the shimmering water, and the abundant wildlife. The lessons were always memorable, whether we caught a lot of fish or not. Although we fished countless times together throughout our lives, one particular day stands out in my mind. It was a summer day in 1965. Summers in Michigan are beautiful, with comfortable temperatures and clear blue skies. I was 9 years old and my brother was 5. My dad had taken us fishing at one of the many small lakes around Jackson. On that day, my dad was teaching my brother and me how to cast. We were both working on it, mostly in silence, until my dad's voice finally broke a period of stillness. "Hey, Lyndon, don't move for a minute, please." I looked back and watched my dad move his hand towards his face. Calm and deliberate, he continued to speak. "Now, Lyndon, always make sure that you know not only where your pole is, where you're starting to cast." At this point, I realized my dad was working my brother's hook out of his own ear. "But also make certain that you know where everyone else is around you." Think of the patience of Tony's dad, right? His brother had reared his fishing pole back, ready to cast, and he wasn't looking where everyone else was. and the hook got caught in Tony's dad's ear, right? He's just talking his son through like lessons as he's taking it out of his own ear. I think that requires a lot of patience. I also learned something about proper casting that day. I learned something about proper casting that day, but I also learned something about patience. Years later, when I got hooked myself in my hand, I realized how much it hurts. Remembering my dad's patience that day when Lyndon's hook was caught in his ear, I finally understood the importance of staying calm and communicating clearly. My father taught physiology at Jackson Community College. Both he and my mom had advanced degrees from Michigan State. She an MA in English and he a PhD in physiology. But you'd have been hard-pressed to know that my dad was Dr. Wilbur Dungy. He always introduced himself as Will, and that was how everyone knew him. In fact, after he had known my dad for 8 years, my friend Lovie Smith, now the head coach of the Chicago Bears, ran across something that referred to my dad as Dr. Dungy. "Tony, is this right? I've talked with your father countless times over the years and spent many a practice with him. He's a doctor?" My dad didn't have the financial means to attend the University of Michigan coming out of high school, so he started at Jackson Community College, which gave him the experience of learning in a college setting. He then went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. After earning his undergraduate degree, he joined the Army Air Corps. Then, after returning and teaching for a year at a segregated high school in Alexandria, Virginia, my dad went back to Jackson Community College, where he became one of the first African American professors in the state community college system. While working on his PhD at Michigan State, my dad continued to teach one class a week at JCC. Although my dad has always considered the University of Michigan his alma mater, those 3 years at Michigan State, while my mom and dad earned their advanced degrees, had a dramatic impact on me. We were there from 1963 to 1966, and while I vividly remember looking at microscope slides with my dad, I remember being just as enthralled by Duffy Daughtry's Spartan football teams. Those Michigan State teams ultimately altered the trajectory of my life in an unexpected way. As for the slides, my dad earned his doctorate by studying the effects of cigarette smoking on laboratory rats. He never did tell me how he got the rats to smoke all those cigarettes, but that wasn't the point. I saw many slides of normal rat hearts and lungs, and I also saw stunning slides of rat hearts and lungs that had been exposed to and damaged by cigarette smoke. From the 3rd grade on, I've never had any desire to experiment with any of that stuff, a valuable side benefit of my dad's education. It also taught me something I have to put use as a coach. If I want my players to remember something, one picture isn't worth 1,000 words. It's better. We moved back to Jackson in 1966 after my dad's graduation, and he resumed teaching full-time. His goal was to provide students who needed to start at JCC the same eye-opening college experience he had enjoyed. Like my mom, he focused on squeezing every bit of potential from his students, especially those who were struggling. My mom and dad were a perfectly matched set. My father often said, "If you're going to be a good teacher, you can't just teach the A students. A good teacher is one who helps everybody earn an A." Note that he didn't say he would give anybody an A, but that he would help his students earn it. There's an important difference. I remind my assistant coaches of that approach every so often. My dad believed you can't teach only one way with only one syllabus, because while some students might get it, others won't. Students have different ways of learning and connecting, and it's the teacher's job to make sure they are all doing so. In the same way, coaches must help players earn an A, that is, learn the material we're presenting, by communicating in a way that makes sense for each individual player. That's one reason I've always hired coaches who value teaching and communication. So we're slowly starting to get a sense here of perhaps Tony Dungy's coaching style a little bit, and a lot of it has been influenced based off his parents. We know his mom was a high school teacher, and his dad taught at the college level. Specifically, he taught at Jackson Community College. Right, and he was very smart, right? He studied the effects of cigarette smoke on rats, which is fascinating and scary all at the same time. And so Tony learned a lot of lessons from his parents about how you approach people, that you don't give up on people just because they don't understand something the first time, but perhaps you will present it to them in a different way, and they might catch on in that way, right? He says there in that those last 2 sentences, that by communicating in a way that makes sense for each individual player. That's one reason I've always hired coaches who value teaching and communication, right? Is a coach able to break things down and explain things to a player in a way that makes sense to the player, and thereby perhaps making that person a better player, right, and therefore a better teammate. So we're starting to get a little bit of a sense of his coaching philosophy here. My dad was always fascinated by how and why things worked, but at the end of the day, he was most concerned with character. He believed that most of life was an object lesson, and he always found ways to pass those lessons on to his kids. One day, I was complaining to him about the unfairness of life. I forget the situation, but I know he agreed that I had been wronged. His response had stayed with me for many years, even though it took me a while to completely figure it out. When I was in the service, he said, they didn't want to teach us how to fly planes, so we taught ourselves to fly. We, blacks, African Americans. Tuskegee is located about 40 miles east of Montgomery, in the heart of Alabama. Founded by General Thomas Simpson Woodward in 1833, the town was allegedly named for a nearby Native American tribe, the Tuskegees. Throughout the years, it has been best known for Tuskegee University, which dates back to 1881, and the school's first president, Booker T. Washington. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps selected Tuskegee as a training ground for its fledgling program to train black pilots, who up to that point had been barred from flying in the military. This was a Tuskegee experiment. Until 1946, when blacks were fully integrated into military training, Tuskegee trained roughly 1,000 pilots, none of whom were shot down during World War II bombing runs in Europe. Tuskegee also trained all of the support personnel that kept those planes operational throughout the war. My father was part of the Tuskegee experiment. I never knew this until my dad's funeral service in 2004, when someone shared the story during one of their eulogies. Why hadn't he told me about Tuskegee? Maybe it's because he believed the greater point was a lesson. What's important is not the accolades and memories of success, but the way you respond when opportunities are denied. Because I was just a kid, I didn't think to ask for more details when he said we taught ourselves to fly. It sounded easy. The lesson, which I did not understand clearly until much later, was that you shouldn't allow external issues to be a hindrance, whether those issues are based on race or any other factor. Things will go wrong at times. You can't always control circumstances. However, you can always control your attitude, approach, and response. Your options are to complain or to look ahead and figure out how to make the situation better. I use what I learned from that lesson daily and almost minute by minute on game day. Okay, it's a great last paragraph that you should go back and highlight and reread there. My siblings and I learned about the unfairness of life in the Dungy household on a regular basis, or so it seemed to us at the time. My parents believed in treating us all as individuals we were, which didn't fully make sense to me until I became a parent myself. I often got into trouble for getting home late. I might have a curfew of 8 o'clock, and if I stayed out playing basketball until 9 or 9:30, my dad would reprimand me. But at least he always knew where I was. Not being where you said you would be at the time you said you would be there, that was a big deal in our house, as was not doing what you said you would do. I learned that pretty early. If you said you were going to do something, you'd better do it. Of course, our parents gave us the latitude to learn those lessons. They trusted us in a lot of ways that parents aren't able to today. When my parents were getting their advanced degrees at Michigan State in East Lansing, our family lived in the married student housing units on campus. My parents usually allowed me to play basketball with local high school kids or even Michigan State students, even though I was still in elementary school. They didn't need to be there. It was a different era. Initially, I could play at the elementary school until the streetlights came on. Later, they'd let me play with some of the high school kids at MSU's intramural building, even after dark. My sister Sherry often got upset because I usually stayed later than I was supposed to and didn't seem to get in as much trouble as my siblings did for the same infraction. The problem I faced, which my dad understood, was that because I was so little, I rarely got picked for a team. The winning team stayed on the court to face the challengers, comprised of the guy whose turn it was to be captain. He had next, plus 4 guys he picked. If my team lost, I'd have to wait until my next came up, and it was my turn to pick a team. Those were usually the times I came home at an hour late, and my dad never seemed to get too mad. After we moved back to Jackson, where I attended junior high and high school, I began playing ball with guys who could drive. We'd drive to Ann Arbor or East Lansing, both about a half-hour away, to play at the intramural buildings at the University of Michigan and Michigan State. During that time, I formed a lot of friendships with guys I would later play against in high school. When I got old enough to drive, I'd go anywhere I could find an open court in a game. It was during this time that I became friends with Bob Elliott from Ann Arbor, who later played center for the University of Arizona and the New Jersey Nets. He'd call the house with a cryptic message. They're playing in Romulus, Michigan, home of Detroit Metro Airport, an hour from Jackson. Or meet me at the MSU IM, the Michigan State Intramural Building. And I'd tell my mom I was going to play as I headed out the door. She always gave her blessing. She never thought I'd get into trouble. As a cheerleading advisor, she watched all the high school basketball games, so she knew most of the guys I was playing with. In the summer before our senior year, Bob put a team together, and we played in the high school division of the Summer League, the most competitive of its kind, at St. Cecilia Catholic Church in Detroit. A different division, open to players at every level, including the NBA, played later on. Those of us playing in the earlier games stayed to watch the likes of Dave Bing, who played in the NBA for 12 years, George Gervin, and others. Gervin was at Eastern Michigan at the time, and while most teams were pretty loaded with all-star lineups, he had surrounded himself with his high school buddies. But he carried them to wins most nights by scoring 50 or 60 points himself. When you're the Iceman and go on to be third all-time in NBA season scoring titles, you can surround yourself with just about anyone, I suppose, and still win. Bob Elliott and I have remained great friends ever since those days of barnstorming any and every game we could find. But in today's world, I can't picture allowing my high school son, Eric, to drive from our home in Indianapolis to Lafayette or Bloomington by himself. I don't think he'd even ask. Times were different then, which was good for a gym rat like me. As a kid, I wasn't too much of a discipline problem, though I did end up sitting on the couch, not allowed to go out and play more often than I would have liked. For me, it was much more worse than a spanking. Usually my mom and dad were calm and gave us the whys and hows of the situation before they took away privileges. All 4 Dungy kids were disciplined in different ways. My folks knew that certain things would change my behavior, but not Lyndon's. So even though I'd moan about it, they did whatever they thought would work best with each child. My parents always looked at every situation individually, regardless of what seemed fair to us. That's something that took me a while to appreciate, but learning to view each situation by itself has helped me in coaching. I know that I can have blanket rules, but blanket rules don't always fit each individual. I need to treat everybody fairly, but fair doesn't always mean equal. So again, we're getting this sense of how he got this basis for how he coaches, because he was talking a few minutes ago about how, each coach needs to change their style a little bit to help each individual player. And here he's talking about how his parents changed their parenting style each a little bit for each individual kid, right? Depending on the kid, they changed their parenting style for what would best fit that kid. And we see how he has carried that on now to his coaching career. I apply that lesson quite frequently with players. Some guys can handle more responsibility while some aren't ready. A rookie might simply get an explanation from me, while a veteran making the same mistake might get torched. The veteran should know better, while the rookie is just learning. To whom much is given, much is required, whether it's privileges, responsibilities, or material items. And if God has given you a lot of ability, I believe you should be held to a higher level of expectation. Let me read that again. Do you agree or disagree with this? To whom much is given, much is required, whether it's privileges, responsibilities, or material items. And if God has given you a lot of ability, I believe you should be held to a higher level of expectation. It's hard to overestimate the importance of the lessons my parents taught me, lessons that have molded and shaped me, the necessity of persistence, the value of education, the fun of athletics, and the importance of living up to your potential. However, there is one gift they bestowed that I would place above all others: faith. My grandfather on my dad's side was a minister who occasionally taught courses at Detroit Bible College. 2 of my father's brothers became ministers as well. As a kid, I understood that Sundays meant good eating. When I was 3, my grandparents moved from Jackson to a 2-story home in Detroit. Their church of about 150 met on the first floor, while my grandparents lived above the church on the second floor. Each Sunday, about halfway through the service, we could smell the dinner that my grandmother was cooking upstairs. We'd wait for the service to end and then slip up the side entrance to their rooms for Sunday dinner. My grandmother always greeted us with excuses ready. I couldn't find my best knife, or I couldn't find my shortening, so I used something else, or this rhubarb pie has been in the freezer for 2 weeks, but we'll try it. Regardless of the excuses, Sunday dinner was always good. My mother's side of the family also gave me plenty of godly heritage. Her parents were God-fearing people of high integrity who died before I was 10. My mother was a phenomenal storyteller, and from her I learned the importance of illustrating a lesson with a word picture. She taught Sunday school every week, And usually, as with her Jackson High lessons, she practiced her Sunday school lessons on us Thursday or Friday night. I knew a ton of Bible stories before I could even read a Bible. A rich heritage. As far back as I can remember, I understood who Jesus was, that he died because of the things I'd done wrong, and that I could go to heaven if I asked him into my life. I'm guessing I was about 5 when I first learned that. Despite the Christian lifestyle my parents molded for me, a real understanding of what it means to make Jesus the Lord of my life, number one in my life, wouldn't hit home until many years later, when I was in the NFL in Pittsburgh. I can't place a value on the lessons I learned and on the faith my parents imparted day after day after day. Actually, I can. The value is eternal. So chapter 2 is quite a long chapter in this book, but it's laying the foundation for how he became the person that he is today. And it's all based on how his parents raised him. And again, as I've stated before, you can see some of their practices and how they raised him reflected in his coaching style.